I always just loved inventing worlds and drawing and spent hours inside my own head coming up with those worlds. For a number of years, I spent most of my time doing political activism and doing some design work for social movements. Well, what's installed at the Kemper Museum right now is part of the series or installation that I'm working on over time right now called Red Mars. And what I do is I come up with a fictional character who makes the artworks, sort of a narrative conceptual art. For example, in this series, my fictional artist is a guy, working class guy, who thinks he can see the future of a colonized Mars through a telescope in his backyard. And he sort of writes down the stories of the people he sees and what they do, and makes paintings and drawings and poetry out of the lives of these people he imagines seeing on Mars 100 years in the future. I don't think art itself can change the world. That's social movements change policies, social revolutions change governments, that kind of thing. Art is something else. But what I do think art is supposed to do is something both spiritual and social. So it needs to tell the truth about what life is like, but it needs to do so in a way that valorizes human beings' stories. And that's what I want my work to do. Now, one of the things I think that happens when you just tell the story just like in a documentary fashion, that's important, but that isn't necessarily what a painting is going to be good at or a sculpture is going to be good at. What it can do is it can valorize it in a different way. It can show the materials of what life is like, or the hand of the artist, or the hand of a fictional artist or something like that. It can give weight to lives that maybe don't have enough weight. Politics and social struggle, but the determinant role, I believe, in actually changing the world is regular people organizing themselves to change the world. What I think for art is something different. Art allows us to imagine being other people, imagine different worlds, different universes. The art critic Ernst Fischer put it that human beings rebel against having to consume ourselves within the limits of our own lives. And what happens when you go and see a movie and you imagine being a medieval knight, or you stand in front of a Rothko painting being surrounded by a field of color, is you escape the confines of your own life. And for me, what I want my work to do is talk about the constraints that exist on the majority of human beings in our society, but not in some abstract, generalized propaganda way, but how it actually impacts those individuals' personalities, subjectivities, creativity. And by creating fantastic stories to go along with it, it allows you to tell those stories in a new way. Yeah, I would hope that there would be a push-pull for the viewer of the artwork. Sort of and I don't know if you're familiar with Brechtian theater. So for example, I put stickers on the surface of some of my paintings to highlight, to interrupt the sort of window pane experience and contrast the unique painting with the reproduced image, the mechanically reproduced image. For example, I produced a booklet that told the story of these characters as the fictional artist saw them, but also included really crudely price information about the paintings to sort of have the contrast between the narrative story, the subjective experience, and then the cold reality of what art is. It's a commodity, and there's no getting around that unless we live in a society that's not a capitalist society, that kind of thing. One of the things that really interests me was underground conceptual art in Eastern Europe and in Moscow, particularly the narrative conceptual element. One of the things that people remark on is conceptual art in the West frequently dealt with a sort of definition, like the Joseph Kosuth 3 chairs or whatever. Whereas in Eastern Europe and in Moscow, it tended to deal more with stories, more with coming up with a counter narrative to the official false narrative of the dictatorships people lived under. So I'm very interested in work of people like Nego Solikov, Ilya Kubakov, who came up with these alternate stories for their work to inhabit. I'm also interested in the work of William Kentridge, the South African artist. I'm also really interested in the work of Emory Douglas, who was the main artist of the Black Panther newspaper in the 60s and 70s, who would combine hand-drawn materials with collage elements, and it's what Amira Baraka called an expressionist agitprop. So there's a number of things in art history I look to. I think in terms of ideas, I really look to the surrealists and the idea that there's a relationship between the social world that we find ourselves in and our mental world. And there's a collective social subconscious. And I don't mean that in a mystical, spiritual kind of way, although it is spiritual lowercase s. I mean that society has libidinal impulses, dreams, things that we all hope for, or horrible things we want to enact because of how frustratingly constrained life is for the majority of people. And by that I mean people getting beaten up by the police for no reason other than the skin color, working class trans youth who aren't allowed to transition or can't afford to, people being deported, things like that, where we aren't as free as we like to think we are in terms of shaping our identities and shaping what we want to be. So that's what really interests me. This is the thing I happen to be decent at, that I can contribute something. Art is a human necessity. It's like food, shelter, sex, companionship. It's not quite as high up as shelter and sex, but like it's on the top 5 or 6. And it's something human beings need. We've been doing it from when we were still hunter-gatherers. We made art. It's part of what being a human being is, part of rebelling against that, consuming ourselves in the confines of our own individual existence. I'm sympathetic to Joseph Beuys arguing that everybody should be an artist. Art has an important relationship to the dream life of people. And in that way, it's both a thing that has value unto itself, but is also a battleground for ideas.